Welcome to the World Leisure Pathways, Past, Present, and Future Conversations podcast series. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our listeners worldwide, and welcome again to the World Leisure Pathways, Past, Present, and Future Conversations podcast series created by the World Leisure Organization in the framework of the 70th anniversary. My name is Cristina Ortega. I am the WLO Chief Operating Officer, and at today's episode, we are accompanied by two distinguished scholars particularly committed to gender equality and the inclusion and visibility of women in global leisure agendas. World Leisure is delighted to have Karla Henderson and Heather Gibson on this podcast to provide us with some relevant insights on leisure and gender. Karla Henderson is currently Professor Emerita in the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management at North Carolina State University. She has given numerous presentations throughout the world, written books, and published regularly on topics related to social justice, women and gender, physical activity, camping and youth development, and research and evaluation. Karla now enjoys hiking, snowing, volunteering at Rocky Mountain National Park, playing her trumpet, playing with her cats, and writing her blog, Wandering with Karla. She was one of the organizers of the Taskforce on Women of what was formerly the World Leisure and Recreation Association. And at today's episode, she will give us a deep insight on this important milestone. Heather Gibson, she is currently a professor in the Department of Tourism, Hospitality, and Event Management at the University of Florida. She is also the chair of the Special Interest Groups on Women and Gender, and her involvement in this group goes back to the Commission on Women and Gender in the mid-90s and early 20s. Her research, leisure, tourism, and sport with a focus on gender and life states. Some of her projects include all-female travel groups, Girlfriend, Gateways, Solo Women Travelers, and leisure travel in mid and later life. Well, let's start with the conversation. Karla, in late 80s, you were one of the first members and organizers of the Taskforce on Women from the World Leisure and Recreation Association. What was the context and genesis of its formation?
Well, it was 1988 at one of the early conferences of World Leisure held at Lake Louise, Canada. And that particular conference, there were a number of people there providing various kinds of research presentations as well as other presentations. Well, one thing that became obvious to us was the gender imbalance on the board. At that time, there were 35 men on the board and one woman. So there were a number of us there, Brenda Robertson, Sue Markham, Deb Bolesky, myself, some other folks too, who said, this is outrageous. We can't, this is just not right. It's 1988. We need to do something about that. So the night before we left, we had a big banquet at World Leisure, and someone had told us that the board was meeting the next day, and if we had a petition that would request that we have a task force on women, that they would look at it that next morning. So, this is back in the days before we had, internets and computers and all that. So somebody wrote on a piece of paper, we, the undersigned, believe there should be a task force on women. And we went, during that whole meal, we went table to table trying to get people who would sign our petition. And we ended up, I think they told us we had to have 25 or 30 names on it. So when we explained the fact that it's so imbalanced, we needed to have a commission to look at this. Our ideas were, number one, to get more involvement of women on the World Leisure group. And then number two, to begin to look at some of the issues that affected women in the world. So that was how it got started. In terms of getting going. The next day, the board did, in fact, approve a task force on women. and we were able to have a representative there. And then over the next several years, there was a very concerted effort by World Leisure to get more women on the board, and that balance did change fairly quickly once it was brought to the attention that this was a problem.
Thank you, Karla, for clarifying the origins of this movement. Karla and Heather, both of you, in your opinion, what was foundational about the early feminist leisure studies from individuals such as Diane Woodward, Eileen Green, Rosemary Dean, Sheila Scratton, Susho, and others?
Karla, I think you start, because I think what would be good would be that chronological, and then I'll chip in.
Yeah, the years between 1988 and 1997, when we finally did have the Commission on Women in Gender established, we did a lot of behind the scenes work in terms of the visibility of women. There was a lot of communication going back and forth between people. At that time, some of the foundational studies, All Work and No Play, a variety of different books, particularly coming out of Britain, came about, as well as the book that my colleagues, Sue Shaw, Val Freisinger, and Deb Bolesky and I wrote about a leisure of one's own in 1989. So there's a lot of literature now coming out of this whole thing. And this literature then provided for the framework for subsequent World Leisure meetings, where we had more and more people presenting research and actually trying to add to this body of knowledge, going beyond just a representation issue to actually what was going on. And I think Heather came in about 1997 or so, the meeting at Cardiff, which was probably the high point, where we had 16 presentations. We actually had a keynote given by a woman, which was the first time that had happened in the organization. But I think it was those early women that were providing that baseline, that foundation, moving forward.
And I would also say, for somebody that was in graduate school at that time, and then I would consider myself second generation within this feminist movement within leisure studies, it was also, one, it provided us with different theoretical paradigms, but also research method. Certainly in North American leisure sciences, I think the dominance of survey-based research and a very much objective view of the world was challenged by the feminist scholars within leisure sciences. So with Karla, Sue Shaw up in Canada, Deb Bolesky, I think that added to what was going on in the UK within leisure studies associations. So the likes of Eileen Green, Sheila Scranton, Becky Watson would be my generation. And then also down in Australia with ANZLS, I think the work of Betsy Waring in particular, and her book in 1998, Leisure and Feminist Theory, was very formative. And so that blending of new ideas, as Karla said, that grouping of a very strong grouping, multi-generational of feminist scholars. And I think what World Leisure gave us within the task force into the commission was it gave us a meeting point. It brought together all of those country-based leisure studies, leisure sciences organizations, and put us in one community and in one space. And that World Leisure Congress in Cardiff, I think, was very formative. And it led on from there into a number of different years of World Leisure, when we had different accomplishments and different aspects to the field as a whole.
I think there was also a growing question raised throughout this time about whether the focus should be as women as a separate group, or how do we integrate with all other aspects of world leisure. So I think after the mid 90s, we were really looking at issues of aging, disability, race, class, and gender as part of this whole discussion. And that was, I think, sort of the second wave of this movement too, was to go beyond saying we just need to focus on women and their representation in issues, but how does that intersect with everything else? And then also looking at how as an organization like World Leisure, how do we take different interests, whether they're in education or research or management or whatever, and include women and gender as an analysis for all of those kinds of things. And I think that was the importance of the second generation of Heather's group and so on that was carrying on the ideas of this.
Yeah, and I think another formative conference within World Leisure was 2000, because once again, we had our own sessions. We had a scientific panel then where we'd actually reviewed and assessed the abstracts, and we had keynotes again. And I think what that did for us is it gave us a chance to have a community within a wider community at the conference. So as Karla said, we were very much aware of how we intersected with different aspects of society, but also other commissions. Many of us also had membership in the other commissions, later level management, and we were able to bring, what we were talking about in the Women and Gender Commission into the other commissions as well. I think it was very strong at that point. And we were still, Karla, we were still on the project of the board, even though the board had more representation, a broader representation in gender. I still remember 2002 in KL, Josephine Burden, who was the chair of the commission at that point, standing up in the AGM and still challenging how was the board elected. And we really wanted to see that visibility in that process.
Thank you. Heather, you have already mentioned something, but maybe, I don't know if you want to add anything about how did the task force evolve into the Women and Gender Commission, and what were the earlier successes of the group within World Leisure organization during the 90s?
I think I was thinking about this from my memory that the conversations during the 1998 Congress in Brazil were as we were transitioning from task force to commission. And as I said, the 2000 conference, we already had commission status, and that was a very strong, very strong feminist scholar presence from all over the world at that point. And, the ability, and I've always maintained this, the ability to have our own sessions within the wider Congress was always where I think we felt, supported and at home, but also I think it brought the ability for certainly junior scholars. They found a space where they were welcome and that they could come in and get new ideas, and we would all listen to each other's research. And I think having a presence in the program, and then also having keynotes, plenaries, provided us also wider visibility within the overall World Leisure. And I think we've started to lose that when the discussion about World Leisure changed in the restructuring away from commissions. And I felt at that point, that's where we lost a lot of our original group and our original members, because we were very focused, as I said, on change within World Leisure. We were very focused on mentoring scholarship. And then also we had various different projects where we just, I think, needed more energy and more resources after that. We had an oral history project, which is a little bit like what you're doing with these podcasts right now, where we wanted to interview and record for posterity the founders of the commission at that point. And we have some interviews already done, but we kind of lost the impetus within there. And it kind of leads us into some of our later questions, I think, Christina, where you're asking later on about where we are today. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Karla, you want to say something?
No, I just really wanted to add that I think that we were really one of the leaders in the world in terms of leisure stuff. This wasn't happening in other organizations like the National Recreation and Park Association, for example, in the US, or in sports management or even that much in tourism. There were bits of it, but I think that during the 90s, we were really a model of how you could incorporate women in leisure. And I think that's significant that World Leisure was, as it should have been, a leader in this area. That's just what I wanted to add to that.
And I think just as a follow-up on that, I think the legacy is still there today. Karla, you mentioned tourism, and I think there was a crossover of some of us that were leisure scholars and tourism scholars, and that we brought in women, a feminist perspective into tourism research. But then 20 years later, now I've seen organization again of female tourism scholars asking some of the same questions we had 20, 30 years ago, which is, on conference panels, where are the women? Where are the female scholars? And they've had to ask that. Whereas I feel that we've somewhat achieved that, that the presence of female scholars, feminist research within leisure has been well accepted and has matured in that respect.
Excellent. Well, let's change the topic a little bit. Let's talk about the postmodern turn and post-structuralism. Heather, how did it, since it was proposed by feminist scholars, how do you think it further leisure studies leading into the 21st century?
I think that was quite an interesting time period, and it was certainly post-structuralism was very much led by leisure feminist scholars in Australia, so Betsy Waring, and then in the UK coming out of LSA. And I remember sitting at an LSA conference in the early 90s where a lot of discussion about postmodernism, post-structuralism was beginning to occur. And it had the effect at that point, I think, of initiating research and thinking in a different way, because within post-structuralism, I was just flipping through Diana Perry's Feminisms in Leisure Studies just before this, just to see what was going on, to remind myself. And Liz Burberry writes about the post-structural feminist theory as one of the most misunderstood. And I agree. I think that what we were talking about was reshaping our understanding of power and where power emanates from. So that idea that power was not just top down, that power could be bottom up. And so we started talking about leisure as sites of resistance, for example, where women had, and also other disempowered people, had the chance to push back through leisure practice. And I think that was quite formative in changing our thinking at that time.
This question is for both of you. Maybe Karla, you can start. What were the challenges to maintaining the feminist presence at the World Leisure Organization over the years?
Yeah, well, I feel like there had always been a fair amount of support. I felt like when we asked for things like having keynotes and having a little more representation, that those kinds of things occurred, maybe sometimes reluctantly, but I think people saw that that's important. That's this, we need to do this. And I think we'd establish ourselves as a presence in the world leisure. I think though, the challenges have been, well, for example, in 2002, all of the commissions were eliminated. And that really slowed the momentum down of the group. And then in 2008, they were really trying to be reestablished, but we never quite got that traction. And again, I think we're looking at where does this whole issue of women and gender fit in a bigger picture. I mentioned we started out, we were a task force on women, then we became a commission on women and gender, and now we're a special interest group on gender. Well, I don't discount the need to look at gender, and that is much more inclusive, but also there are still issues that are important for women, and globally, I think that's true. We like to think in some of the more developed countries that we've done a pretty good job of representation in general. And yet there are many countries where women are still, not represented well in anything related to what's going on. I was at the meeting yesterday morning about the new special interest group on human rights. And I think that's a wonderful idea. Women are a part of human rights, but sometimes I feel like when we become so broad, then we lose, what are the special unique issues for certain groups of people, including women. So I think that's a real challenge and a real balance. We want to be for human rights, but also we don't want women just become one of, 10 different, disadvantaged groups that we're looking at.
Heather, would you like to say something to this conversation?
Yeah, I would agree with Karla's assessment that, when the commission all of the commissions were disbanded and then we were brought back, we really had lost momentum. And I think also, many of our members had turned away from world leisure at that point for various different reasons. Some of it was philosophy, some of it was career stage, and we never seem to get that momentum back. I think there's still a need for, as Karla said, a focus on women and gender. I think the pandemic has shown us some of that, that, in the so-called Western world, we've seen increased, reports about gender imbalance within the home. Well, that harks back to many of the projects that we had back in the 1980s that have been evident during the pandemic. I also think that looking around the world right now, what Jill Valentine used to call the geography of fear is still very much present. If I talk to students about traveling solo or going in an Airbnb by themselves, and many of them will talk to me, particularly the women students, about, no, I wouldn't do that because of safety. So the issues are still there. We've gained, I think, in both in the academy, as I said, broadly, leisure studies, leisure sciences. We've certainly I've got a very strong presence across different boards, across different editorialships, very strong female presence. I think we've brought a focus to different methodologies. How do we approach our research? I think that was very much led by the feminist scholars. And now, as we said early on, that we're seeing certainly women scholars in the global South, increasingly are researching about women, leisure, gender, leisure, intersectionality, and leisure. So I think we're still there. I think there's still a need to have that focus within a special interest group, because I think it provides a community. I think our challenge right now is, how do we reach out and bring more people back within that membership, within that fold? And I think I would hope that having a face-to-face conference again might help us with that as we look forward to a new World Leisure Congress. But I think that's our biggest challenge.
I agree with what Heather has said about all of this. I think we just need to continue the presence, continue the topic going. I think we need to recognize the evolution in many cases, from just looking at representation or gender equality to looking at issues of power and authority as that relates to women. I keep thinking about women as opposed to no notion of gender, and I know gender is more encompassing, and I think that's important because the two interact. Gender and women are important, but I just don't want to lose sight of the fact that women are a group that we need to continue to focus on it as well, even though maybe that's an idea that was really important 35 years ago and not so important today, but I think it still is.
We might say that the Commission on Women and Gender, now called Leisure and Gender Special Interest Group, as well as the visibility of feminist research, has not gained new traction in the past 15 years. Heather or Karla, why do you think that has this movement seemed to stall?
Well, I think we've kind of addressed that already, but there are so many issues that are important these days. And again, I come back to what I said earlier, that I think we need to look at women and gender in a context of all kinds of other issues, and continue to think about the need for looking at the gaps that are there, what don't we know yet, and also keep in mind that we're as countries across the world, we're all at different stages of development. And I think we need to recognize those and continue to focus on those as best we can. Again, when you try to do everything to everybody, sometimes you do nothing for anybody. But I think we need to continue to look at those gaps and think about where can we make the most impact. And then I'm hoping that we can continue to grow after that.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I feel that there's still, as we said before, there's still a need. And the idea that there are different scholarships around the world at different stages. I think an organization like World Leisure and the Special Interest Group is a good place for those scholars to find a home. Because I think, if I go back to the early stages in my career, in my generation of leisure scholars, being in the Taskforce and then the Women and Gender Commission, I think was very formative for us. It gave us a global perspective. It gave us conversations with women scholars at all generations, and it exposed us to many different issues. And I think that's what we've always seen within World Leisure, is it's given us that global insight. As much as we love to be tourists and go and visit different countries, I think it's more valuable than that. I think it's about giving us insights that if we stayed within our own countrywide associations, we wouldn't see that. And I think that's been the value of World Leisure. And I think that's maybe where we need to leverage that with the new generation coming forward, is that there are still issues that are pertinent to women, and different countries have different issues, but also some of the same, which is what we've always said within feminist research. And that World Leisure provides us with not only a voice, but also a space. I think that space is very important to provide visibility to that research, but also to provide, I keep coming back to that idea of community. And I think that community has the potential to be strong again. We've just got to find a way of recreating that energy that we had in the 90s.
And let me ask you a final question. Is the study of women and gender still relevant today? Is there a need for new lenses on this topic going into the future? What do you think?
Yes, that's my answer. Yes. And I think we're going to, that's the challenges, as Heather was just saying, to find those new lenses. I think there's a whole variety of things. It's much more complicated today, but absolutely issues related to women and gender, we are still relevant. We need to keep moving forward and not let that topic, not feel like we've been there, done that. We don't need it anymore. We still need it.
I would say the same thing. In terms of new lenses and new approaches, I think there's always been a generational difference in many ways, that the younger scholars are often where we learn new ideas. I think, when you're in graduate school, when you're in the early stages of your career, maybe there's more time or opportunity or motivation, I'm not even sure what it is, to embrace new ideas. And I think, as I said, trying to build back that sense of community again with the multi-generational community, I think is very important, and to be able to take on some of the challenges that women still face globally. And I think that's very important, that we have that global perspective and that we're willing and able to listen to all of the different voices.
Karla, Heather, it has been a pleasure to listen to you, and hopefully this conversation will touch many people, especially young generations, so that they can learn from you and be inspired by your work and the history of this committee. Thank you all for listening, and until next time, keep in touch.